talk about Iran stuff. I don't know. We did have some thoughts this past week, but let's maybe start off with Karaja. I hope I'm saying that right. Karja
Yeah.
facility,
I've been
maybe.
saying Courage.
Karaj. Okay.
Yeah.
This facility is in Iran, and there is some nuclear activity that I guess takes place here, like that. All above board kind of stuff by Iran. And those cameras were damaged in an Israeli sabotage attack in June. And the IAEA has been demanding and complaining that Iran isn't in compliance because they won't put the cameras back. And Iran is saying, well, we'll put the cameras back if you blame the Israelis for it, which seems fairly sensible to me. But Connor, we finally got a deal to kind of resolve this. So what's happening here?
So it's called the Tessa complex. They build centrifuges there. They don't operate them on site, which is one of the reasons why Iran has pointed out, and as Jason Ditz does here, that them doing this is purely voluntary, allowing the IAEA to reinstall these cameras. Because and I'll just point out that I mean, this has been going on for months. We've been covering this on the show, that Iran had continued to say to the IAEA, look, if you condemn this attack that the Israelis carried out with a drone, I believe it was on June 23rd. And I don't remember if I pointed this out on the previous show, but I have in my articles, and I think we covered this months ago. But that attack, it's notable that when the Times, I think it was a week ago or maybe 2 weeks ago, there was a piece out in the Times where they said that about sort of the Israeli pressure on America during vis-a-vis the deal, and then Trita Parsi wrote up something about it as well. We talked about, but the what they said, that the Israelis consulted Washington before the attack, and I kind of knew that because there was a military delegation that had been sent to Washington from Israel, and I think Aviv Kohavi was a part of it. But anyway, they sent a delegation to Washington to talk about Iran, and then talks ended on, I believe, the 20th, culminating or around the time of the election of Ibrahim Raisi, and then this attack was carried out, I believe, on the 23rd. So it was nearly concurrent. But I'll just say that, so they've agreed to reinstall to allow the IAEA to reinstall the cameras. Now, from what I've seen, I sent you an article from Nor News, which is an Iranian outlet that I understand is apparently close to the National Security Council. But they claim that they did, and I've seen in other reports in Israeli media as well, that the Iranians apparently got the IAEA to condemn the attack. And in fact, the quote is, if you look at that article, they say, accordingly, and it's also interesting because it sounds like they had their own experts inspect the cameras before they were installed by the IAEA, because there have been accusations that previously the cameras that were there may have been used as to gather intelligence or to somehow play a role in the Israeli attack. So what it says here is, accordingly, after finishing the main part of judiciary security investigations on damaged cameras, as well as IEA's condemning sabotage in the Karaj Tessa complex and accepting technical inspection of cameras by Iranian experts, before installation, Iran has voluntarily allowed the IAEA to replace new cameras. Rafael Grossi, the IAEA chief, came out and said this agreement with Iran on replacing cameras at the Karaj facility is an important development for the IAEA's verification and monitoring activities in Iran. It will enable us to resume necessary continuity of knowledge at this facility, which this is also notable because we talked about last week that he did an interview with the Associated Press Monday or Tuesday of last week, I believe, and said because they didn't have this, the Europeans and the Americans and the IAEA made a huge deal out of them not replacing these cameras like it was the end of the world or something, particularly the Europeans. But now they're going to I thought you mentioned this on the show, and I think you're absolutely right. This was a smart move for Iran to do. I think you said that they might get together again on the additional protocol. It sounds like that there's not going to be a new monitoring agreement probably until presumably they restore or get the or revive the JCPOA, or at least get the Americans to return to the deal. But this was good optics for the Iranians, because now they can know the Europeans and the Americans and Rafael Grossi and the IAEA, cannot use this as rhetoric to say that Iran is like stonewalling them or something, which, they usually won't provide all the necessary context. The parliament passed a law as well, saying that the Iranian parliament, that those recordings will not be accessible to the IAEA until, pending an agreement on the JCPOA and sanctions being lifted. And then there will be, of course, with that, like I said, the new monitoring agreement, maybe even maybe even they'll go back to the additional protocol and the snap inspections and that sort of thing. But right now it's under the footage is under joint control. But the reports I read from Noor News suggest that the footage will be right now it belongs to the Atomic Energy Association of Iran. But that they will be able to, the IAEA will be able to see it and get to the and have the footage after there's an agreement reached in Vienna. So that's about everything I have on what's going on with the IAEA. And then let's see. So as far as the talks go, the latest news is you have the Europeans coming out and suggesting that, they're kind of echoing American rhetoric, and they're saying that they put out a joint statement before the UN Security Council meeting last week, where we covered that the Secretary General of the UN said that he was going to push for a reimplementation for people to, or for the nations, but he was basically saying that the Americans should roll back and put an end to these unilateral sanctions, and that there should be a real implementation of Security Council Resolution 2231. So I don't know. I guess to offset that, the Europeans came out and did the Americans' dirty work for them, and came out and put out a very aggressive joint statement that said they accuse Iran of accelerating their nuclear program, curtailing IAEA monitoring, undermining international peace and security, walking back previously made compromises while presenting additional maximalist demands, which we've talked about before. They're mad because the Iranians are requesting more sanctions relief than the Americans are willing to grant them, and they want them to stick with these unofficial draft agreements that are full of brackets and were never fully agreed upon anyway, because the Americans were being dishonest negotiating partners and were insisting on, basically, they wouldn't agree to provide a guarantee that the Americans wouldn't leave the deal on a whim, even during the rest of the Biden administration, which means that their promises of sanctions relief and would mean nothing, and Iran would end up giving up all their leverage in exchange for, presumably continued economic war and even threats of kinetic war. And they were insisting that the Iranians negotiate their independent foreign policy, their relationship with their allies in the region, and their ballistic missile deterrent, which was of course a non-starter. So from my understanding, is that the so-called hardliners of the Raisi government, their negotiating delegation, is insisting on a full implementation of the JCPOA as it was written in 2015, which the Americans never granted them the sanctions relief that was promised in the deal. They even imposed more sanctions the day the deal was signed. So they've also talked about, as we've said here before, that they would like to see compensation for the damage done by the sanctions. And there's sort of an internal debate on whether to use that as leverage for talks, the demands for compensation, that is, and whether or not they should be asking to be repaid for the damage done after Trump left the deal, or even going back to, Obama, after the deal had been signed, sending around American representatives to strong-arm international businesses and financial institutions behind closed doors, telling them not to do business with Iran, and, saying one thing and doing another, directly contravening the deal itself. So But the Europeans are putting out this very hostile statement. Now they do say stuff like, well, there has been some technical progress in the last 24 hours, and I assume they're talking about the agreement to reinstall cameras in the Karaj facility. Now, so again, I think that was a good move by the Iranians, because I mean, even their joint statement now seems, even if you by their spin, it seems out of date already. But so I got this report from Responsible Statecraft from, let's see, from Eldar Mamedov, who also talks about how they're saying that we're rapidly reaching, the end of the road. The JCPOA will be hollowed out because of Iran's nuclear advancements. And of course, there's these typical accusations. We'll get to more about because Robert Malley is making similar statements now, that they've been expanding their nuclear program as leverage. But that was already ongoing, and of course, that was in response to so many, particularly the Israeli sabotage attacks at the Natanz facility, which is their main center for building centrifuges, and also, of course, their attacks on Iranian ships and things, and increasing American sanctions and threats. So, but they're trying to paint, to this day, they're still trying to paint. When they say that, I assume they're talking about the new cascades that went online at the Fordo facility around the time talks began. But as Jason Ditz and Dave DeCamp point out at antiwar.com, that process was ongoing long before talks even restarted or were scheduled for the end of November. So I'll also say that the Russian lead negotiator in Vienna, Mikhail Ulyanov, seems to be, to some extent, rebuking these European claims and the American rhetoric by saying we should not rush to hasty conclusions about the deal's imminent collapse. And as I've said before, it's really disingenuous to act like Iran is somehow. Like the deal can't be. There's no way to return the U.S. to the deal because of Iran's nuclear advancement, when the whole problem is they have not lifted sanctions and they have not stopped. The Israelis have continued to attack. The Americans have imposed more sanctions. They're still waging a brutal economic war against the civilian population of the country. And I have to say, it was very funny because, not funny, but just it's so hypocritical, I guess, is what we're seeing now, at least Reuters reported Thursday, is that the talks are on pause since last Friday. Now, they're supposed to reconvene. One diplomat said, they cited 3 diplomats. One of them said that talks would reconvene, I believe, on the 27th of December. And then somebody else said, well, maybe between Christmas and the beginning of next year, meaning before January 1st, but after Christmas, something like that. So now, the Europeans claim that they're disappointed in the pause on talks, which is ironic to me because it's not as if Europe is under sanctions. The Iranians are. But I'll just say that Ali Bagheri Khani, the lead negotiator for Iran in Vienna, has said it's interesting because there's always this contrast. They're saying positive things about what's going on. They said, we have made good progress this week. We'll convene a joint commission today and continue talks after a break of a few days. So I mean, let's see. And then I also found out in that report from Responsible Statecraft that it sounds like the Iranian hardliners, as I said earlier, are actually trying to cover their right flank at home and build support in critical areas for their efforts in Vienna to return the Americans to the deal and gain further support for negotiations. So it says here that Amir the foreign minister, Amir Abdollahian, he's traveled to Hussein Amir Abdollahian has been traveling to the holy city of Qom to meet with senior ayatollahs to garner support for the negotiations. And so that seems to me to be sort of a mismatch, that the Iranians are also saying, as we talked about last week, that their proposals are now being reviewed. Here's another interesting thing. So today, Saeed Khatizbeda, the foreign ministry spokesman of Iran came out, and this is a report that's fresh at antiwar.com. U.S. envoy for Iran warns time is running out on nuclear talks. This is what I mean about the mismatch. So you have Saeed Khatibzadeh coming out and saying that the parties have agreed to continue talks built upon Iran's new proposals, which they insist, contrary to the American and European rhetoric, are not them, just walking back and being intransigent and you know, rescinding compromises made under the previous government in the earlier negotiations this year. They said that, yeah, we changed maybe about 30% of it, but those weren't official to begin with. But we are building our new proposals on our nuclear obligations and on sanctions relief based off of the previous negotiations, and that they're willing to negotiate. And they've said they've encouraged the Europeans to have their own counter proposals and draft proposals, which I don't believe to this. I mean, unless you've seen something different, I haven't seen any reports about the Europeans yet coming up with any official documents to, have reviewed and negotiated. Yeah, Khatibzadeh says the parties have agreed on 2 new texts, the result of intense discussions in recent days in Vienna. These are documents in which Iran's position has been taken into account and on the basis of which we can continue future discussions. So maybe this is some sort of a negotiating strategy on the part of the Americans and the Europeans, because Malley came out today and said to CNN, at some point in the not so distant future, we will have to conclude that the JCPOA is no more, and we'd have to negotiate a wholly new, different deal. And of course, we'd go through a period of escalating crisis, which is, of course, very aggressive. And he says if they continue at their current pace, we have some weeks left, but not much more than that, at which point I think the conclusion will be that there's no deal to be revived. And he says it seems very clear Iran is trying to build leverage by expanding their nuclear program and hoping to use that leverage to get a better deal. But again, as Dave points out, that they could only be talking about the only possible thing they could be referring to that has happened since they reconvened talks would be the stuff that happened at Fordo. But as we said, that predates even the scheduling of the talks. So their argument is nonsense. Of course, they've expanded their program, but everybody knew that. They did it directly in response to, like I said, the previous attacks. So the other thing that's interesting is there's a report from Jeremy Scahill at The Intercept that now we have a new statement from a letter put out by the Washington Institute, which is a think tank, as Jeremy Scahill describes it, as a militarist think tank. And now this letter is headlined by former CIA directors Leon Panetta and, of course, General David Petraeus. And Michelle Flournoy, who founded Center for New American Security, previously the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under Obama. These people have a lot of blood on their hands. Flournoy, of course, engineered the wars in the surge in Afghanistan, much like David Petraeus, responsible for no doubt at least tens of thousands of deaths in Afghanistan. Also, Flournoy helped, and I'll say Petraeus as well. We know from Gareth Porter's great work on the Syrian dirty war, was involved in funneling weapons from Libya to Syria, and to aid Al-Qaeda affiliates against Damascus, and Flournoy was helping engineering that war as well. So, but they're saying it is vital to restore Iran's fear that its current nuclear path will trigger the use of force against it by the United States. So they're almost echoing the Israeli rhetoric of the last several weeks we've been covering, that they want the Americans to come out and now, make really forceful threats of war to Iran, who they claim essentially are trying to keep an option open to have a nuclear weapon. I'll get into their quotes here in a second, but let's see. They argue that Biden must, quote, take steps that lead Iran to believe that persisting in its current behavior and rejecting a reasonable diplomatic resolution will put to risk its entire nuclear infrastructure, one built painstakingly over the last 3 decades. Now, we've talked about last week that report from Reuters that caused a big controversy the Iranians responded to, that said that it was 2 weeks ago, but they said that the talks, we talked about it last week, but they said that before Benny Gantz, the Israeli defense minister, when he was in Washington, that the day before he arrived there to talk with Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, that they were going to discuss joint military drills to practice bombing Iran's nuclear facilities. We'll get to that again here soon, but now there was kind of an official ambiguous response, like John Kirby said, I'm not going to get into it, but we discuss things like that all the time. And so now they're openly calling for, quote, high profile military exercises by the U.S. Central Command, potentially in concert with allies and partners that simulate what would be involved in such a significant operation, including rehearsing air-to-ground attacks on hardened targets and the suppression of Iranian missile batteries. This, of course, comes off the heels of Israel resuming, practicing their attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities, and they've approved a $1.5 billion budget increase to prepare for an attack on Iran. When Gantz met with Austin, he said, all options are on the table if diplomacy fails. Gantz called for military readiness and said there were even reports that said that he presented a timeline to the U.S. officials about when an attack would take place. Now they claim that they're trying to force Iran to the negotiating table, as Scahill says, to compel it to reverse any efforts to develop nuclear weapons. And they say, quote, while the United States has recognized Iran's right to civilian nuclear power, Iran's behavior continues to indicate that it not only wants to preserve a nuclear weapons option, but it's actively moving toward developing that capability. So that's obviously not true. But the argument is that, of course, that they've enriched to 60% with the uranium hexafluoride directly. They don't say this, but directly in response to the attack on the Natanz facility in April. So they argue that, well, that's, much closer than when they were after the Israelis killed the scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in late November. They increased enrichment of uranium tetrafluoride to 20%, and that was done really to run the Tehran Medical Research Reactor, which provides nuclear medicine and medical isotopes for I believe 1 million patients in Iran, where frankly there's myriad shortages of medical equipment and critical medicine. So but anyway, they always do this. They'll hype it up like Iran is racing to a bomb when they've never done any such thing, and there's no evidence that they have. So they are essentially saying that they have a latent deterrent, but they haven't sought a weapon. It's considered haram. The Ayatollahs, both of them, Khomeini and Khamenei, of bandits. So this is just more propaganda. But I do like how Jeremy quotes Trita Parsi here, and he says, Donald Trump's military threats and broad economic sanctions are precisely why we're in this mess right now. To believe that more Trumpian conduct by the United States will break the nuclear deadlock bewilders the mind. Trump's exit from the deal and the lack of confidence that the United States will stay in the deal beyond 2024 has profoundly undermined the value of American promises of sanctions relief. The Iranians are hesitating largely because they do not believe that the economic benefits the U.S. promises will be forthcoming, and no amount of military threats will change that fundamental weakness in the U.S. negotiating position. So, if anything, that's only going to increase Iran's advancement with its nuclear program. Although I think the way I'm sort of reading what's happening right now, it seems like there is more progress being made in Vienna than meets the eye. Although but that could just be the Iranians and the Chinese and the Russians and maybe even the Europeans, at least behind closed doors, are making progress, but that the Americans have maintained their status quo, which is essentially, as we've said before, we hope for a return to the deal, but as far as what we've seen this movie before, it doesn't look like the Americans are serious. So,
Connor,
now,
can I ask you about my favorite development in the past week was the seeming realization from Israel that, we've long known at antiwar.com, but have been writing articles on in the past week, is that, look, this doesn't work, Israel attacking Iran, without the Americans doing it. And so what we're talking about is, Israel fighting Iran till the last American. So Yeah, I mean, but it seems that the Israelis have come to realize this a little bit. And
Yeah.
I think that's important that, if the US isn't willing to go along with an Israeli attack on Iran, that attack cannot happen. So if the US isn't willing to do it, then something needs to be done to save the JCPOA, because I think the worst possible scenario really is the JCPOA dies, but Israel continues to be very aggressive against Iran. So where are all the details with this, Connor?
Yeah. So, yeah, Israel has been making, as I've referenced, and people have no doubt heard on the show, these, you know, highly aggressive threats. Essentially saying we're going to act alone, we're going to go to war, we're going to attack Iran, we're preparing for an attack. I already went through that, but now they seem to be dialing, as Jason says here, dialing back, walking back their threats. So there was a piece from the New York Times that cites. They spoke with current and former senior Israeli military officials who basically, and there's been a growing consensus about this that has been reported on at Responsible Statecraft as well, where it seems like more and more even hawkish Israeli former high up military officials are coming out and saying, look, we can't do this. So one of the things that they talk about is, like we said last week, that they claim they need they requested, Gantz apparently asked Austin for these like 8 KC-46 strata tankers, I think they're called, the refueling aircraft from Boeing, because they need those in order to fly to Iran, bomb Iran, and fly back. Otherwise, they'd have to rely on like aging aircraft and land in and land in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And from the reporting I've seen, and you can imagine, that's not that's not an appealing option for the Gulf states. Now, if I'll just read a bit from the New York Times piece so people can get an idea of like what it sounds like. To your point, that there's a lot of quotes in there where they say things like, in fact, as Jason quotes here, Ralik Shafir, the retired general they speak to, says, quote, the only Air Force that can maintain this campaign is the U.S. Air Force. And if you look at the Times piece, they go, Iran has dozens of nuclear sites, some deep underground, that would be hard for Israeli bombs to quickly penetrate and destroy, Mr. Shafir said. The Israeli Air Force does not have warplanes large enough to carry the latest bunker busting bombs, so the more protected sites would have to be struck repeatedly with less effective missiles, a process that might take days or even weeks, Mr. Shafir added. And they go, one current security official said Israel did not currently have the ability to inflict any significant damage to the underground facilities at Natanz and Fordow. And such an effort would be complicated by a shortage of the refueling planes. The ability to refuel is crucial for a bomber that may have to travel more than 2,000 miles round trip, and crossing over Arab countries that would not want to be a refueling stop for an Israeli strike. And then they talk about what I was just saying about the tankers, the KC-46 tankers. And also they talk about how if they tried this, they go, it would likely set off retaliatory attacks from Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza, allies of Iran that would try to force Israel to fight a war on several fronts simultaneously. So yeah, it's this operation is not possible. They would need the Americans to do it. I don't think the Americans want a war with Iran. In fact, I'll be honest, I don't think the Israelis want a war with Iran either, because the phony Iranian threat, as we've talked about, it's the best excuse they have to continue to milk the American aid. And I don't think they want to kill that golden goose. And I don't think it would work out in there. I think they would suffer massive damage and casualties in that kind of a war. I don't think Israel would win. I mean, America might have. I don't need, honestly, that's a country of 80 million people. They've got incredible asymmetric capabilities. Who knows exactly how Russia and China would act? It's too big of a can of worms to get involved in. And I think that the Americans have known for quite a while. There's they're real hawks who are way out on the fringe, who even people like Dick Cheney or Sheldon Adelson, or even Mike Pompeo maybe, or John Bolton, who would want to see something like this happen eventually. But I think they're outnumbered by thankfully, by cooler heads, even in the military establishment. The whole mantra from the early days after 9/11 that real men go to Tehran was tempered by the massive failures in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it doesn't seem like it doesn't seem like they want another major war in the Middle East right now. But so the Israelis are saying basically this seems like they're walking back from this, and the Iranians know that they can't pull this up. So there's a report here from antiwar.com where the head of Iran's military central headquarters came out and said, quote, any threat to Iran's nuclear and military bases by the Zionist regime is not possible without the green light support of the United States. They also, I think, in a message to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who they've been building ties with, particularly Saudi Arabia, but also the UAE lately, they said, if Israel carries out attacks against Iran, our armed forces will immediately attack all centers, bases, routes, and spaces used to carry out the aggression. That's another thing that they talked about in the Times piece, that they're concerned that if the Israelis did launch an attack, that the Iranian surface to surface missiles would destroy their runways even. So now the Iran carried out military exercises in southern Iran recently and practiced air defense drills or conducted air defense drills near their Bashir nuclear power plant in southwestern Iran. And yeah, essentially, as Dave just wraps it up here and just talking about like what I was just saying, that the Israelis have been claiming that they can act alone, but it appears more and more that is simply not the case. And Gantz recently spoke. Even Gantz seems to be sort of winding back. He spoke at the Knesset Foreign Affairs Committee, and I don't know. He sounds like he read or just stole and plagiarized one of the European joint statements. He just said that Iran is actually, he says it's possible and necessary to put an end to Iran's foot dragging strategy, sort of implying that they're not taking it seriously. And then he says Iran is coming into negotiations without real bargaining chips, which I think is clearly not true. Their expansion of their nuclear program they've been able to bring the Americans, the Europeans, everybody back to Vienna for negotiations, and the Israelis are clearly losing their minds over all this because they fear if there is a return to the deal, that, like I said, that they have a lot to lose because they can no longer use, to the extent that they have in the past, the excuse of the Iranian threat, which would be even, that's the whole point of the JCPOA in the first place, is to take the war that the Israelis are constantly threatening to start unilaterally, which would immediately draw the Americans into it, and it would be an absolute disaster. And that the worst neocon hawks and previously, I think the Saudis and some of the Gulf states would have wanted, but it appears that there's a lot of developments in the region. Trita Parsi just had a recent great piece you ran at antiwar.com as the Spotlight called toward a new. Do you remember what the title of that is? It's Toward a New Middle East or something like that.
That sounds about right, Connor. I don't remember the exact title of that article. Trita has written like 3 or 4 really good articles on this topic in the past 2 weeks.
But so yeah, he basically talks about everything that the bag. He compares side to side the American and the Israelis' Abraham Accord strategy of sort of building this, what they would call like a NATO-style anti-Iran alliance, where they sell the Americans stage manage these normalization deals, or they throw the Palestinians under the bus and then sell a bunch of arms to countries like the UAE and Bahrain, and then they encircle Iran with weapons, and it's sort of built around isolating Iran. But these countries, now that it appears America is leaving the region, you see them taking missile defenses out of Saudi Arabia and other actions. You see they see the pivot to Asia, and so now they're moving and they're talking to each other more, and long-time rivals are negotiating, or not negotiating, but they're engaging in substantive diplomacy, it appears. So and as even as we talked about, the UAE and Iran, Saudi Arabia and Iran, Turkey and the UAE, and of course the Saudis and the UAE are talking with the Qataris. They lifted their blockade, so there are things that are changing rapidly, and the Israelis seem to be trying to put their foot in the door and hit the brakes on all this. But I think the momentum is too great, and I think the Americans are dead set on really focusing on Russia and China right now. So in that sense, we do see some deflation in the Israeli rhetoric and the Israeli position. I think that's good news. So as far as that and what the Iranians are saying about the talks, I'd say that, when we'll see what happens when they reconvene and get back together. But based on the desperation that I can sort of, parcel out of the rhetoric, even from this statement from Flournoy and Petraeus, they sound like they're out of ideas. And hopefully that means something good is coming.
Yep. So, and it may be like a week before we learn too much more or so until the talks reconvene and everything. So who knows, Connor? Maybe we'll talk about something else next Wednesday on the show other than Iran. But if there's a bunch of big news, we'll certainly be back to talk about it. And thanks so much for answering that question, because I do think possibly America and Israel are waking up to the Iran reality. And if they are, that's very important development, because it so far through the Biden administration, it didn't seem like they were quite awake to the true reality there. So, Connor, thanks